Welcome to Today's Walk with Dr. Roger Spradlin from Valley Baptist Church, the program helping you to understand the Bible today.
Welcome to Today's Walk. I'm Kate Neighbors here with Pastor Roger Spradlin. We've got a nice new set.
We sure do.
Yeah, and we're going to be jumping in with a two-part series about what?
Well, we're going to look at an amazing story of a prison guard that became a Christian.
Let's jump in and watch life's most important question.
We're going to look today at a story of a Roman soldier who was baptized. He was actually baptized by a Jewish apostle. So the question is, why would a Roman soldier back then in the first century allow himself to be dunked by a Jew? So I think maybe we ought to set the context of this story. Paul was an apostle, but he was also a missionary. And along with another missionary called Silas, they went to various cities as kind of itinerant preachers, and they would preach the gospel in these various towns and try to start churches there. They eventually came to a city called Philippi, which is up in modern-day northern Greece. And there they were preaching on the streets, preaching outside. All preaching in the first century basically was outside because there were no church buildings in those days. And there was a little girl that would follow them, and the Bible tells us this little girl was demon-possessed. Let's pick up the story in Acts chapter 16 and verse number 17. The girl followed Paul and us, cried out, saying, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." Now, I think what was happening is Satan was using this little girl in kind of a reverse psychology. Satan wanted to discredit the Apostle Paul and Silas, and by using this little demented girl, he kind of was discrediting them, because every time Paul would stand up to preach, this little girl would say, listen to them. They're servants of the Most High God. Well, it became very distracting. And eventually Paul had enough of it. Verse number 18. It says, she did this for many days. So this goes on for a long time. And Paul was greatly annoyed. He turned and said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out that very hour. Now we learn also in this story that this girl was a slave, as she belonged to a group of men that were making money off of her in her demented state, because evidently with this demon, she had the ability to tell people's fortunes. Well, when the demon was cast out of her, she lost that ability. Let's pick it up in verse number 19. And when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And they brought them to the magistrates and said, these men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city. And they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or to observe. Now that was actually a lie, because the Apostle Paul was a Roman citizen himself, and it was perfectly legal for him to be speaking in the marketplace. It tells us so later in this story that there was a multitude that rose up against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes, not their own clothes. They tore off Paul and Silas's clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. And so they were severely beaten, and then they were thrown into prison, and they commanded the jailer to keep them very securely. So having received a charge like that, he put them in the inner part of the prison, and he fastened their feet in stocks, and he put them in chains. I mean, there was no hope of escape like that. Now you would think, having been beaten like that, and your feet in stocks, you're immobile, and you're in chains, that they would have kind of a pity party. But that's not really what happened. Look with me in verse number 25, or listen. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. You talk about a captive audience, they had it. They're talking to these other inmates. They're there with them all night long, and they're praying and singing at midnight and rejoicing in the Lord. Verse number 26. Suddenly, there was a great earthquake, So the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's chains were loosed. It says there was a great earthquake. Now, when God calls it a big one, it is a big one. With this earthquake, the bars are twisted, and the doors fall off their hinges, and the stocks they were in were loosened, the chains fell off. Paul and Silas were free to go. Verse number 27. And the keeper of the prison, awakening from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew a sword and was about to kill himself. But Paul called with a loud voice, saying, do yourself no harm, for we are all here. The keeper of the prison was asleep on the job. And he woke up, and he sees that the prison doors are open. He assumes all the prisoners have fled. And he knows it's not going to go very well for him with the Romans, or his family for that matter, being asleep on the job. I guess they didn't have a union back then, so he knows that he's in trouble. And so he thinks, well, I'll just commit hara-kiri. And he pulls out his sword. He's about to take his own life in order to spare his family and so forth. And Paul, with a loud voice, says, do yourself no harm. We're all here. And the Roman soldier is absolutely shocked. I mean, they're free to go, and yet they hadn't escaped. And so he calls for a light because they're kind of in a dungeon. And he ran in and he fell down trembling, it says, before Paul and Silas. And he asked a question. Verse number 30. He called for a light, ran in, and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. And verse 30, he brought them out and said, sirs, what must I do to be saved? I think that may just be the most important question in all the Bible. I don't think he's asking, what do I have to do to be saved from this earthquake? He's already survived that. The shaking is all stopped. I don't think he's asking, what do I have to do to be saved from the Romans, that are officials that I'm going to be in trouble with? I think he's asking a spiritual question. And the reason I think that is because the answer they gave him was a spiritual answer. Now, this guy had been listening to the prayers of these godly men. He had fallen asleep listening to the songs that they were singing, and he perceived that they were men of God. They had a chance to escape, and they didn't. They showed that they had compassion and concern for him, their guard. And think about it. This is the guy that had fastened their feet in stocks, that put the chains on. He may have been one of the soldiers that had beaten them, but now he's asking them a spiritual question. What do I have to do to be saved? Now, I've got to admit, the word saved is kind of a churchy word. And sometimes when people come to church or they listen to a message like this, and it's maybe for the very first time, they don't really understand some of the words that we tend to use at church, because sometimes we use kind of churchy words. We use words like theology. We talk about God being omniscient or the immutability of God. We use words like salvation, regeneration, justification, sanctification, depravity, election. Sometimes preachers talk about systems of theology like Calvinism or Arminianism or supralapsarianism, and people sometimes theologically want to know, well, are you a dichotomous or a trichotomous? And theologians speak of consubstantiation, transubstantiation. We talk about ecclesiology, eschatology, pneumatology. Well, I'm not going to use any of those words today, okay? Because I want to put the message on the bottom shelf. I don't want to use simply the words of the initiated. I want to be careful this morning or today to explain to you the gospel. Now, the word gospel simply means good news. And sometimes we talk about the gospel and we say how the gospel is going to help you. It'll help you be happy, and how you're going to be a better husband or a better wife. You're going to be a better person because of the gospel. But we never get around to explaining what the gospel is. Well, the message today is about the gospel, of how we're made right with God. But there is one kind of churchy word that I'm going to use, because the Philippian jailer used that. It is the word saved. What must I do to be saved? I think that's a good word. It's a Bible word. You may ask, well, what does it mean? Well, the dictionary says the word save means to be delivered or deliver from harm or danger. It means to guard from injury or destruction or loss. It simply means to be rescued. If you're drowning and someone in a boat comes along, reaches in and pulls you in the boat and rescues you, you have been saved. And so it means to be rescued. On that dark night, in that damp, dank dungeon, the Roman jailer from Greece asked the question, what must I do to be saved? It's a good question, right? But the question is, for us, what is he talking about? What is it that he wants to be saved from? If it's not the earthquake, and if it's not the Romans, then what is it that you and I spiritually need to be saved from? Well, here's the first principle. We need to be saved from sin. Now, I got to tell you, sin is another one of those archaic words. It's a word that's not used much in the vocabulary of our culture. It's considered outdated. In fact, we only use the word, in derision in our culture. People say, well, I ate too much chocolate last night. I really sinned. But sin is an important word because it's a Bible word. I mean, today, instead of sin, we speak about personality disorders or alternative lifestyles. We speak about sickness instead of sin, or weakness instead of wickedness. But simply redefining our moral values does nothing to deal with the guilt that comes from sin. All the psychiatry of the world cannot relieve the guilt of sin. The reality is, all of us have failures. All of us have skeletons and hanging in our past, things that we have done wrong, sins that we have committed. And sin creates with it a sense of guilt in our life. And God, and only God, can relieve us from that guilt. Sin is really a universal problem. In Romans 3:23 it says, for all, A-double-L, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In some ways, this verse highlights the definition of sin, because the word sin literally means to miss the mark. It's an archery word. It's as if there's a target and we shoot an arrow at it and it goes to the right or left or it falls short. The target is the moral perfection of God. And we've all missed that, right? No one's perfect. We've all sinned. We've fallen short at some point. Not only in the way that God wants us to live, we've even fallen short in the way we ourselves want to live. We don't even live up to our own sense of right and wrong, let alone living up to God's. We have all sinned. And so we long in many ways to be rescued from the failure of the past and the guilt, to be rescued from the things that we've done that we wish we had not done, from the guilt that we feel. We all wish we could be saved from sin, that there would be some knight come along riding on a white horse that would deliver us from our failures. Well, that's what it means to be saved spiritually. It means to be delivered. It means to be forgiven, delivered from the power and the guilt of sin. It's as if God has this big eraser, and when we come to Christ, He erases all the failures of our past, and He gives us a clean slate. In fact, the Bible uses these words, that we are born again. He gives us this new spiritual life. So first of all, we all need to be saved from sin. But there's a second principle. We need to be saved from spiritual death. Now, death isn't a very pleasant topic, is it? I mean, we don't want to really talk about that. Most of us have been to the central coast of California where there's the Hearst Castle. It's an amazing structure. William Randolph Hearst was a very wealthy man. He built this castle up on a hill. And all the political elite and the famous celebrities of his day, they would come and visit and have these lavish dinners and so forth, and great conversations. And you could talk about anything virtually. At those parties, you could talk about politics and entertainment and current events. But Hearst had said, there's one thing, if you're my guest, that you cannot speak about in my presence, and that is death. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to face his own death. And there's that same kind of hesitancy within our culture today. We don't want to think about our own death. Many states now have removed all signs that say dead end, because it's offensive to people. They're driving down the road and all of a sudden there's a sign that says dead end. They go, dead. Someday I'm going to die. And, it reminds them of that. And they don't like that. They don't want to think about that. And so now the signs across the country do not say dead end. They say no accessible outlet. Well, let me tell you something. Someday you are going to have no accessible outlet. The reality is thousands of people die every year in our culture needlessly because they refuse to go to the doctor. They're afraid. They know that something is wrong in their body, but they're afraid to go to the doctor. They think, well, the doctor's going to tell me that I'm going to die, or the doctor's going to tell me that I have cancer, or the doctor's going to tell me that something's wrong with my heart. And they wait really until it's too late. Fear of death pervades our culture, particularly right now. And yet, from the moment that we're born, we begin to die. You know where death comes from? Death is a result of sin. Those two concepts are tied together. When God created humanity, He created a man and a woman, Adam and Eve, and He placed them in this beautiful garden called Eden. And He gave them a very simple rule, just basically one rule. He said, there's one tree that I don't want you to eat of this tree. You have dominion over all the world, but don't eat of this tree. In the moment that you eat of it, in the day that you eat of it, you're going to die. Well, they ate of the tree. Did their tongues swell up? Did they begin to choke? Did they kill over dead instantly? No, not immediately. But eventually they did die, because from that moment on, the cells in their body began to deteriorate. God had created human beings to live forever, but because of sin, decay and death came into the world. In fact, the Bible says the wage of sin is death. But the word death is used on a different level in the New Testament. It's used not only about physical death, we're all acquainted with that, but spiritual death. Fundamentally, death is separation. When a person dies physically, their spirit leaves their body. And when the spirit is no longer joined the body, that person is dead. We take the body and we bury it with great care, it's cremated. But when the spirit leaves the body, that person is physically dead. So as long as your spirit is in your body, you're physically alive. But when that separation takes place between your body and your spirit, you're physically dead. Spiritual death also is separation. But it's not the separation of the body and the spirit, it's the separation of God and our spirit. When God said to Adam, in the day that you eat that fruit, if you disobey me, you're going to die. Now, when they ate the fruit, physically, they began to slowly die. But spiritually, they died immediately. Immediately, their spirit was separated from God. Up until then, they were completely united with God. But because of their sin, their spirit was separated from God. And that separation is called in the Bible spiritual death. Now, when Adam and Eve reproduced, they reproduced after their kind, just as all of nature dictates. That's how God set it up. Dogs have puppies, cats have kittens, giraffes don't have hippopotamuses. That's just not the way it works. And when Adam and Eve reproduced, sinners have sinners. So when they had children, they had little human beings, just like you and I. When we have a child, their spirit and their body are joined together, means they are physically alive, but they are born with their spirit and God separated, spiritually dead. You say, wait a minute. That doesn't seem fair that I should be separated from God because of what Adam and Eve did years ago. Well, we make the same choice. Every human being has chosen to sin. I mean, we've all chosen on occasion to lie. In fact, don't get me started. I could give you a whole bunch of things that we've all chosen to do that are wrong, but because of our sin, we are separated from God. So we need to be saved. We need to be rescued, not only from sin, but from spiritual death. But there's a third principle I want to show you. It is this. We need to be saved from eternal death. Another way of saying that is to be saved from hell. Now, that is not a pleasant topic whatsoever. It's very unpleasant. But Jesus actually spoke of hell quite often. Now, most people in our culture no longer believe in hell. Even people who claim to be believing Christians that have been surveyed, people that go to church virtually every Sunday, only 1 in 3 of people like that believe in the existence of hell. In fact, hell in our culture has become a proverbial joke. People say, well, if I go to hell, all my friends will be there and we'll have a big party. Well, all your friends may be there, but it ain't going to be no party, to use some poor grammar. We have a choice whether to accept Christ and be reconciled to God. But if you die having not made that choice, you will become eternally separated from God. That's what hell is. It is eternally separated from God. So we need to be saved from sin, we need to be saved from spiritual death, and we need to be saved from eternal death. The idea of being saved, then, is a very, very important question. But it's also a personal question. Here's the principle. A relationship with God must be personal. It's a personal relationship. No one is going to get to heaven because of their grandma. You may have the best grandma in the world, but that's not how it works. No matter how good she is, you're not going to heaven based on her. You're not going to heaven based on the nation that you live in or the family that you were born into. It is a personal commitment. Now, you may feel like a number when you go to the DMV to renew your driver's license. And you may feel like a number when you go to the Social Security office. But God created you as an individual, and you are absolutely unique. Your fingerprints are unique. Your DNA is unique. You can now be identified with a single strand of hair. You're not 1 in a million, you're 1 in 7.5 billion. If God created us as individuals, then He's going to judge us as individuals, not as a family, not as a church, not as a nation, but by ourselves. We're going to have an answer to God. This Philippian jailer, he was at the end of himself. He was about to kill himself. When he asked the question, what must I do to be saved? What he's doing is admitting his need. And that's the very first step for you and I to come to Christ, is to admit that we have a spiritual need, that we have sinned. And yet our world is filled with people that won't admit that. Now, it's obvious to everyone else that you've sinned, but sometimes it's not obvious to us. People will not admit it. It's like a little child that's been playing outside and they're covered in dirt and grime and maybe mud, and they come in the house and they just track through the house, or they lay on the couch and they just get mud everywhere. They don't even realize they're dirty. That's us sometimes. We don't realize that we're sinners. If you're swimming, you don't need a lifeguard. It's when you're drowning that you need a lifeguard. And it's when your house is on fire that you need a fireman to rescue you. And it's when we realize that we have sinned. That's when we need a Savior, someone to rescue us. Now, sometimes people have a hard time figuring that out. They don't really ever look up until they hit bottom. When life drops out from under them, adversity, calamity, that's when they look up. That's the way with this man, this jailer. He is suicidal. His life's a mess. He knows he's going to be executed by the Romans being asleep on the job. And all of a sudden he looks up and goes, wow, you know what? I need God in my life. There's some people that when they get just a little sniffle, they go to the doctor. But most of us, especially men, we have to really be sick to go to the doctor. Sometimes things have to be really bad in our life before we'll admit that we have sinned. Our life has to be a mess before we will admit that we need God. But we do. This was a personal question. What must I do to be saved? But make no mistake, it is not a private question. Some people say, oh, well, how I stand with God, that's a private matter. No, it's really not. It's a personal matter, but it's not a private matter. If you're drowning, it's a lifeguard's business. If your house is on fire, it's a fireman's business. If you have a spiritual need, it's the church's business. It's my business as a pastor. It's my business as a believer, someone that declares the gospel. Jesus was in the temple one day, and there was a huge crowd all around him. It was a very public place, hundreds of people. And he lifted up his voice and said, "Let him that's athirst come unto me." It was a public invitation to follow Christ. That's why at the end of every message, I extend a public invitation. I say to our people that are watching online and television, call the number on the screen. Someone will help you. You can give your life to Christ. I invite you to give your life to Christ. It's a personal question, but it's not a private matter. In fact, we're supposed to publicly be unashamed of Christ and declare our faith after we become a Christian through baptism. I mean, if your house is on fire and a fireman breaks down the door and he pulls you out of the fire when you're overcome by the smoke, you're not going to be ashamed. I mean, you're going to put your arm around this guy and say, "This is the man. This is the guy that saved me."
That was a wonderful message from our two-part series, Life's Most Important Question. Pastor Roger, today's walk comes from our church, and a lot of times when you preach, you're preaching to our church, and sometimes we have a tendency to use words that maybe our audience doesn't understand, and I would love if you would elaborate on the word saved.
Well, it is a very churchy word in some ways, but the definition really comes out of the common use of the word. If your house is on fire and a fireman comes and drags you out, you've been saved, you've been rescued. If you're drowning and someone pulls you in the boat, you've been rescued or saved. In this case, it's talking spiritually about our need to be rescued from the penalty of sin. We've all sinned, and there's a penalty attached to that, and that penalty is to be separated from God. So to be saved means that we've been rescued from our sin.
If you're watching today and you have questions about the message, there is a number at the bottom of the screen with real people who would love to talk to you about getting saved. Open up the Bible and just look and show you what the Bible has to say about it. They also have a free copy of today's message or any of our messages from today's walk. There's also a website. We want to hear from you guys. This is a special time where we get to come together and learn about the Bible, and we want to extend that free gift to you. So take advantage of it. Pastor Roger, thank you so much. Looking forward to part 2 of this message. Join us next week. This has been Today's Walk, helping you understand the Bible today.
Today's Walk is the broadcast ministry of Valley Baptist Church. This program is supported directly by our church members and viewers like you. You'll find plenty of great resources when you call us or visit our website. Thank you for watching, and join us again next week for Today's Walk from Valley Baptist Church in Bakersfield, California.